I want to take a minute to level with you all and talk about how a month ago or so, I got my hands on a large poster of the all-new ghostwriter Robbie Reyes. The poster, as you can see, is just a blown-up version of the character's premiere issue. And I have read this issue, as well as all of the volumes that Robbie's creator, Felipe Smith, has written for the character. But I didn't necessarily get the poster because of any storyline or moment of character development that personally struck a chord with me as a reader. And this is very much an odd thing to do. Usually when a customer purchases any merchandise for a particular franchise, it's because they're either a big fan of the franchise, or they just have a superficial interest in the product. Now, while I clearly haven't fallen into this first camp, I don't believe I fall into the second camp either. Just looking at the poster, there was just something in my heart that gravitated towards the character and his stories, even though I don't remember being all too gripped or blown away by them myself. So, I did the sensible thing and reread Felipe Smith's work on the character. And I found myself enamored by much of the subtext and implicit nuance that I believe inspired my fascination with the character in the first place. Upon rereading the character's comics, I realized that there was very much an intelligent design behind both the form and the function of this all-new ghostwriter. An abundance of Latin American themes and motifs surround the character and life of Robbie Reyes, apart from the very superficial observation that he is in fact a Latino character, and many of the members of his community are also of Spanish-speaking countries. Throughout the character's first volume in particular, the writer Felipe Smith touches very often on the philosophy and ideas of Latin American identity, as laid out by José Vasconcelos, but without referencing Vasconcelos explicitly. For context, José Vasconcelos was a Mexican philosopher who is famous for having contributed much to the modern perception that many Latin Americans have towards their sense of self, by way of his theory on the significance of Latin American Mestizaje. More on that in a bit. Vasconcelos' ideas were a strong consequence of the Mexican Revolution of the 1900s, which saw not only a revolution of politics, but also revolutions of culture, art, and society. With a few handful of exceptions, not since the pre-Columbian era had history recorded such a strong movement and powerful achievement of political goals by and for the indigenous populations of Latin America, which is why a large focus of Vasconcelos' philosophy turned its attention towards the admiration and rediscovery of Mesoamerican heritage. In his famous essay, La Raza Cósmica, Vasconcelos asserts that the people of Latin America have a very unique sense of self and identity by way of its mestizaje, the quality of having a sense of identity through a shared culture and history between both European Spaniards as well as indigenous Latin American societies. Now, what does this have to do with Robbie Reyes? Well, while mestizaje is the word used to describe Latin American identity, there's also a sort of pun going on with the term. Mestizaje literally refers to the mixture and combination of two things, and for Latin Americans with a strong sense of mestizo identity, it's not uncommon for objects or phenomena that present themselves as having dual or multifaceted aspects as being interpreted as symbols of Latin American identity as a result. And this state of having a dual or dichotomous sense of self is heavily played upon in Robbie Reyes' life, especially in his first volume. When he first becomes the ghostwriter, Robbie initially questions how he's supposed to understand and interpret what he's become. Is he an angel? Is he a demon? Neither. There's something all new entirely. Beyond this, we see dual identities in Robbie's life even before he became the street vigilante, as we learn that he's had to act as both a parent and a child with his brother Gabe, as well as how he navigates his community as a student who has the capacity to succeed academically, while also trying to look like he's too cool for all that. Throughout what we see from Robbie Reyes, he consistently struggles with a sense of two-ness, a state of being caught between two roles or identities, until he ultimately reconciles these dualities and mixes them into a third option. This is a very essential sense of what it means to embrace mestizaje. When I first read All New Ghost Rider, it was this particular scene in the junkyard, where Robbie questions his new identity, that made me recall Vasconcelos, angel or demon, good or evil, dead or alive. It's the presence of death that brings me to my next appreciation of the all-new Ghost Rider for its intelligent design, as it's rather cleverly carried out in my opinion. For us as readers, we are constantly reminded of Robbie's death by way of the design of his Ghost Rider form. His entire costume is literally born from the night of his death. His jumpsuit is the same as the one he was killed in. The skeletal face is a macabre remix of his original helmet. And even the fire he controls recalls the fact that his body was burned alive. Now, this is the lore explanation of the Ghost Rider design. And yet, the way that the members of Robbie's community perceive the spirit of vengeance is very distinct from the reality of his situation. And this touches on one of the most brilliant aspects of the all-new Ghost Rider design and character. Any moderate fan could take a glance at the all-new Ghost Rider design, and they could probably tell that the aesthetic and stylization is meant to play off of the Ghost Rider archetype from generations before, such as Johnny Blaze or Danny Ketch. However, for a Latin American audience, Robbie Reyes' hero design would most likely bring to mind a far different skeletal icon, La Calavera Catrina. Latin American culture is very famous for its style of intermingling and embracing aspects of the dead with traditions such as the Day of the Dead, as well as much of the macabre aestheticism that surrounds the society's famous and popular art. Much of the popularity of the aesthetic of death has its roots in the work of the 20th century Mexican artist José Guadalupe Posada. Posada's design of the famous Latin American icon was a consequence of his work as a political cartoonist in the years before the Mexican Revolution. The original print of La Calavera Catrina was a female skeleton dressed as a European aristocrat, and was printed on a leaflet about a Latin American who desperately clung to European culture while also shunning their indigenous roots. Because of this, La Calavera Catrina was adopted by the public as a very strong representation of what Latin American culture was like during this time. But since Posada's death, and the cultural revolution that came with the Mexican Revolution, La Calavera Catrina has since been embraced by Latin American artists and reinterpreted to serve as an icon of identity by way of remixing the image into a similar skeletal design, but instead adorned with the indigenous and rural fashion of most common folk. La Calavera Catrina has also come to serve as a reminder of the fact that historically and culturally, death has almost always had a strong presence in Latin America. For this, some revere the image as a symbol of the bold attitude of laughing at death, while others have come to adopt it as a synthesis of the Catholic and Mesoamerican attitudes towards death. There's the Spanish perception of death under the phrase memento mori, a reminder that every person is mortal and will meet death someday. And there's the attitude of many Mesoamerican cultures, such as with the Quiché Maya, where one famous skull in particular played an important role in the creation myth of the sun and moon. Through this cultural synthesis, death has come to be both a provider and a reaper. Perhaps Robbie Reyes' Ghost Rider design wasn't created with this particular cultural illusion in mind, but this doesn't diminish the impact that these references and homages to Latin American culture can have for readers who have strong ties to said culture. In fact, personally, it wasn't until issue number 6 of the series that the Calavera aesthetics of All New Ghost Rider became apparent when we see the issue begin with 2 young boys role-playing as the street vigilante with a mask very much resembling the art inspired by José Guadalupe Posada's work. I mentioned that it was in issue number 6 that the artist of All New Ghost Rider sort of put 2 and 2 together and connected Robbie Reyes' design to Latin American skeletal aesthetics. But there's another aspect of All New Ghost Rider number 6 that just makes me gush and bawl in my heart with appreciation for how Robbie Reyes is really portrayed as encapsulating much of the spirit of Latin American identity. And that's the cover art. I want to preface this by being upfront and saying, that I can absolutely be a sucker for comic book cover art sometimes. I've bought some less than stellar issues just for the art alone, and I've even framed them just because I love the cover so much. Now, the cover art for All New Ghost Rider number 6 depicts a small community of people coming together to decorate a wall by painting it with the image of the Ghost Rider in a strong and powerful pose. A very immediate charm to this cover is the fact that it is art of art. But what captures most of my attention is the style of art that we see being depicted in this scene, a mural. In Mexican culture, murals have historically had an important role in both art and society following the Mexican Revolution. Going back to philosopher Jose Vasconcelos, Vasconcelos became Secretary of Public Education, where he sought to manifest his faith in Mexican heritage and culture through a movement of Mexican muralism. Seeking to educate and inspire people of all social classes, rather than only the rich and urban citizens that were accustomed to receiving traditional education, Vasconcelos sponsored large murals that were meant to accomplish a variety of tasks for the public. For one thing, this was meant to make art and artistic expression far more accessible to the public. By orchestrating and commissioning the production of grand murals that were legitimately works of art from Latin American artists such as Diego Rivera, Jose Orozco, and David Siqueiros, who all studied the techniques and styles that were at the forefront of artistic movements during their era, Vasconcelos and these proud artists brought a form of creativity and spiritual expression that was originally reserved for only the very few. Another accomplishment of these murals was the task of historic storytelling. Very often, many of the murals were meant to reflect the life of the citizens who would be walking and appreciating the paintings most every day. Many of these artists, such as Diego Rivera in particular, felt that it only made sense to have these works of art tell the story and culture that many of these citizens shared. Take this mural, for example, where Rivera presents a snapshot of everyday life for a pre-Columbian Mesoamerican society. Not only do we see various citizens going about their day with common tasks, such as farming and laundry, which the everyday audience of these murals could relate with, but we also see the subjects of the foreground of the mural going about a rather specific task in particular: their painting. With this mural, Rivera not only reminds his audience of their indigenous roots as an organized and functioning society, but also inspires them with the notion that the arts, which again, during this time, were largely considered to be reserved only for the aristocrats, but were also present in their history and attainable for them as well. But bringing the conversation back to the cover art for issue number 6, what significance does the muralism movement have here? Well, personally, when I see this art, I'm largely reminded of the fact that the muralist movement was largely for the community of everyday people. The presence of children, students, and families brought together to admire a work of art that is meant to communicate this is what our community is all about, the Ghost Rider, is what the muralist movement sought to uphold. And I'm honestly inspired to see the ideals of community and education that burned so passionately amongst these aforementioned Latin American forefathers live on and manifest in a series whose story dedicates itself to the task of mythologizing and integrating this hero of the streets to the culture and history of their little corner of the world. I'm aware that some people may push back against some of the ideas I presented here today. But what I hope most every viewer takes away from all this is that there's a strong presence of Latin American identity imbued in the character of Robbie Reyes and his series, regardless of whether or not it was intentional, because it doesn't diminish the impact and interpretation that some readers can have after walking away from one of the character's volumes. There's a lot to appreciate about the all-new Ghost Rider, and I hope I've gotten that across.